Oh, and we are live. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday discussion where we are beginning to go over the book written, which is called Revolution by the Book by Imam Jamil Al-Amin. And we discussed last week a brief introduction of this book, the background of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, a civil rights advocate during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and how this book, through this book, Imam Jamil basically explains how, through understanding the Quran, how one can bring about change in their community through our core Islamic principles. So, throughout this book, like we mentioned last week, he focuses a lot on discussing some very basic core principles of Islam, like the five pillars and what have you, principles that many of us are very familiar with, right? Whether you're relatively new Muslim or even Muslim for many, many years, all of us are familiar with the five core uh, um, pillars of Islam and Islam's basic core principles. So through this book, though, he presents these principles of Islam through another perspective and how an understanding and application of these core principles can help bring about a change in your community, which he actually did in his community in Atlanta, where he transformed his community from a community that had a lot of crime, a lot of drug use, a lot really just not a good community, into a community with a strong foundation, a community full of believers, and a community that provided businesses and took drugs out of the community. So really brought a lot of good change in his community through this application. So through this book, we hope to learn together in what process should we each individually take into bringing about change in our own communities, right? So today we're going to be going over just the first two chapters, and like I mentioned, this book is really not that long, hence why we'll be able to go through two chapters a week relatively easily. And so, as per usual, it'll start with me giving like just a brief overview of each chapter, some of the main points of the chapter that I really felt it was important to highlight. Then from there, as per usual, we open the floor for discussion, right? And most of you already know our formula here, but it's always good to give a reminder for those of us who are newcomers to our discussion. So I'll go ahead and start. Bismillah. So the first chapter is titled God Alone. And as the name suggests, this chapter focuses on Imam Jamil's explanation of the category of Tawheed, oneness of Allah, right? Or really, this is more than most huge. In actuality, he mainly focuses on the discussion of the first pillar of Islam, which is the Shahada, the testimony of faith. And so he begins the chapter with discussing the importance of this principle of Tawheed, which he says is, of course, the most important principle. And the first principle being the Shahada is the most important of all pillars, right? And so he gives a brief overview of Tawheed, which we know, of course, is the understanding that, Allah, there is only one God, which is Allah, and He is the one creator, the one master of everything, and He is the all-knowing, and nothing is like Him, and worship Him and Him alone, right? And when he goes over the category of Tawheed, Allah's oneness, and what that means, he kind of discusses how having an understanding of this principle of Tawheed can guide one to success. I just kind of wanted to read this paragraph where he talks about this, how understanding that there is no God but one God, the sole creator who has no partners, who's responsible for all creation. Recognizing this truth is the key method to success, according to Imam Jamil. And he says this in this particular paragraph I wanted to read to all of you, he says, on the basis of strength and recognizing and believing that there is a creator who has established a program which overrides and controls all programs, all agendas, all matter, we can proceed with confidence towards any goal. This confidence founded on faith, Imam, is an essential ingredient to success. For a fearful, doubtful person is unable to struggle. He gives up easily, submits to every oppressor, compromises his integrity, acquiesces in injustice, and accepts enslavement. In contrast, a person who has taqwa, God consciousness, fears only the ruler of the universe, Almighty Allah. He perseveres against the greatest of challenges, maintains integrity, resists injustice, refuses enslavement, and fights oppression without regard to man-made standards. So a very, very powerful paragraph, in my opinion. Right? And so he discusses that basically having an understanding of who Allah is, right? That's what Tawheed really is about. When you say, La ilaha illallah, there's no creator, there's no God but Allah. You're basically, it's understanding who Allah is, who your Lord and Creator is. There's only one Creator. You are the creation, and your sole purpose is to worship Him and Him alone. And what that worship means, and he goes into that as well, which is of course, basically doing good deeds. And he says that when one has this mindset and understands their purpose in life, which is to worship Allah, and what that worship means, everything you do from that point forward is towards that purpose. You have that confidence and know that whatever good that you do in this world is for Allah and Allah alone, not for anyone else. And when you have this mindset, he argues that this allows you to move forward towards any struggle. And he highlights that this is a struggle. He's calling for a struggle to cause change in one's community. But basically, he's saying that when one understands that there is one creator and one master, and their purpose in life is to worship that creator and that master, it instills them confidence, it gives them perspective, and it makes their path clear to where they have no fear of any negative repercussions that can come from them from this world, right? So he talks about how having this understanding of who your creator is and that you worship him and him alone basically helps prepare you for the struggle to come, right? Because like we mentioned, the purpose of this entire book that he wrote is to kind of serve as a guideline for how to create a successful movement, so to speak, to really highlight Islam in your community and bring about positive change to your community, right? So this is step one, right? Step one is Tawheed, he's saying. Knowing who Allah is, knowing what your purpose in life is, and having that understanding will help you have confidence and realize that no matter how harsh the struggle gets or how difficult it may be, as long as your intentions are clear and pure and you know who you're doing it for, you can move forward without any fear, right? And from there, he also discusses the second part of the Shahada, which is, of course, Muhammad Rasulullah, that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Alayhi salatu wasalam, may peace and blessings be upon him. And so he speaks about how now that we know our path to success, what our purpose is, we also have a model for success, whom we should follow in order for us to properly achieve success. That's where he talks about the second part of the Shahada, which is that Muhammad is the messenger or the prophet of Allah. And so he discusses how Allah sent prophets and messengers to his creation in order to teach them who he is and in order to guide them, right? And he discusses how, Allah did not send angels, but instead sent people to people, right? in order to basically make it clear that as human beings, we do not have an excuse to not strive for greatness, to not do our best, because he says that, you know, of course, the Prophet ﷺ is the perfect human being, but these messengers are human beings. They are a means, an example for us to follow, right? And so he says, in order to be successful in this struggle, not only do you need to have the proper mindset, which is, of course, the understanding of Tawheed, but you also need to have a proper model to follow, a role model to follow. And he says here that's basically who our Prophet ﷺ is a role model in order to us to follow, in order to do a proper movement. Because the Prophet ﷺ, as we all know, he transformed his community, right? He established a community of believers and a community of those who stood up for what was right, right? So Imam Jamil is saying here that is our role model whom we follow. And so these are like kind of the first two steps that he mentions in chapter 1 is having that understanding of Tawheed and how the understanding guides you to success because it helps you not be deterred from any sort of negative repercussions that can come from another person. And on top of that, we have our role model, who is our Prophet ﷺ. And so from there, we go into chapter 2, which is titled Born to Worship. And so, as the title suggests, in this chapter, he spends a lot of time speaking about the importance of salah, the importance of prayer. Specifically, he speaks about the importance of salah bi jama'at, congregational prayer. And he puts a lot of emphasis on this, right? And he even talks about how in his khutbahs, his sermons, he would always speak about the importance of prayer, the importance of coming to the masjid and praying in congregation, to the point where a lot of his community members would get irritated. They would basically get tired of him always talking about prayer. They would say things like, why don't you talk about this? Why don't you talk about the economy of Islam? Islam is not just about prayer. And he basically kind of refutes what they're saying. He highlights that, yes, Islam is not just about prayer, but he argues that if one does not have prayer, then everything else is void. Everything else you're trying to that is not going to amount to anything if you don't have salah. And of course, he cites different verses and hadith that talk about the salah. So, for example, he cites Quran chapter 17, verse 78. Establish regular prayers at the sun's decline till the darkness of the night, and the morning prayer and reading. For the prayer and reading in the morning carry their testimony. He speaks about a particular hadith just to highlight that there's no excuse in missing the prayer and the importance of congregational prayers. This particular hadith, though, he did not give a reference as to which particular hadith it's found. It's found in Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, or what have you. So this particular hadith, we should take with a little bit of a grain of salt until I'm able to verify it. But he mentions there's hadith about a blind man named Ibn Masum. Brother Hassi, maybe you'll be able to verify this hadith. But this was a blind companion who went to the Prophet ﷺ and was basically saying that due to his blindness, he did not think he'd be able to make it to the masjid for prayer, make it to the mosque for prayer. He had, very reasonable fears, like, that could be the snakes, the path of scorpions, it could be dangerous. And the Prophet ﷺ said, do you hear the call? Do you hear the call of prayer? The old man said, yes. And the Prophet ﷺ said, then come to the mosque. And he mentions this as to highlight the importance of that time for congregational salah. And Brother Hassi, did you want to add something? Because your mic turned off for a second.
No, so this Sahabi is most probably was Ibn Maktoum. He was a blind.
It's right. Right. The hadith is it's authentic because he doesn't mention like which.
No, I don't know.
No problem. So we don't know exactly, and inshallah, maybe after tonight, I'll try to look up the particular hadith if I can find out which book it's found in. But either way, this hadith does kind of highlight the importance of the congregational salah, right? And this is where he focuses the brunt of his discussion. So the question, of course, is why is he putting so much emphasis on congregational salah, right? The congregational prayer, and he basically talks about how it's through the community coming together and establishing the prayer 5 times a day is how you start, are kind of like the building blocks to establishing a community, right? And he speaks about how the prayer, the salah, coming together as a community helps, create bond, helps the community bond, helps the community stay connected, and it's kind of the building blocks to creating the belief, creating iman, creating belief in a person. And like I mentioned, he spends a lot of time talking about this and how important this is. That if one does not establish the salah, not just pray, but establish it, that you're not going to be able to move forward from there as a community. And, from here, I kind of want to talk about a little bit of history about Imam Jamil. Like we mentioned before, he actually established a masjid, a mosque in his community. And that masjid was truly a community center, right? We always hear, community center, right? And what is a community center when you really think about it? A community center is a place where the community comes together for various activities and to kind of focus on, improving that community and building that community, right? And this is what Imam Jamil Al-Amin did, and he helped make his masjid, the hotspot for his community in Atlanta, right? And it was through the masjid, through making sure that every single prayer, it was being established, the call was being made. He was creating that community of believers who were prepared to go for that struggle of transforming and changing their community for the good, right? So the whole point of his emphasis on the Jama'ah, or the congregational prayer, here is he's saying that this is, he says this is how the Prophet ﷺ established his community of believers in Medina. He mentioned how the Prophet ﷺ, before he established any other building, when he first went to Medina, his first focus was making a masjid. But even before making his place of residence, his own home, it was making a masjid, a community center. And he highlights that it was through having this masjid where all of the community came to pray together, was how the community became one, right? It helped create that unity within the community. And he says that this is absolutely necessary in order to start changing a community and bringing that unity. And that unity is done through the congregational salah, right? And he also just talks about different, again, he really references a lot of different hadith. He speaks about the hadith about when the Prophet ﷺ, he said how if it were not for the women and their children, or he would order those who stayed away from the prayer at the masjid, or order their homes to be burned down, because it was a sign of someone being a hypocrite, or munafiq, so to speak, someone who was not a true believer, right? And this is, of course, a very specific hadith regarding a very specific situation, but just kind of highlighting how important the congregational prayer was to Prophet ﷺ into his community. And that he says we as Muslims need to do our best to establish that same type of congregational prayer. And that we should not look for excuses to stay away from it, but instead do our best to come together for those 5 daily prayers. And of course, right now we're in a pandemic, and a lot of us, may have easier access to masjids than others right now. So I think that's important to mention. But the whole point of this, of course, is one, we of course are very aware how important the congregational prayer is. We know that those who are able to make the congregational prayer get 27 times the reward if it's prayed at home. We're all very aware of this to a certain extent, correct? But again, like I mentioned before, a lot of the verses that he's going to reference, a lot of the hadith he's going to reference, are going to be hadith and verses that many of us have heard time and time again, right? But kind of like how he said in this chapter, how in his sermons he would always talk about the importance of prayer. He'd always repeat that, but there's a purpose to that, right? Because it's introducing a new perspective. So while he may be talking about the importance of prayer, the importance of congregational prayer, something that many of us may consider a very basic concept, he discusses it in another perspective, right? How the congregational prayer establishes a community and brings and provides unity to a community. And this is basically kind of the third building block to his guidelines of fighting or having a struggle towards establishing a good community and bringing about positive change to a community. So very, very interesting chapters. I'm going to go ahead and stop the live streams here. And then from there, I'm going to open the floor for discussion to those who are joining us through Zoom. Those of you who are joining us through either the Facebook Live or the YouTube, please do join us again next week. We'll be going over chapters 3 and 4, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa